Tech debt. You probably feel a certain way when you hear that. Most people hate it. Everybody has it. What's the most effective way to handle it? In this session, you're going to get exposed to several expert perspectives. So let me introduce you to our speakers joining us. So we have James Smith, CEO and co-founder of Bugsnag. Prior to founding Bugsnag, James was CTO at HeyZap and was instrumental in scaling HeyZap from a 3-person company to the world's largest mobile gaming community and mobile ads platform. Tim Correia is the Senior Vice President and General Manager at Trulia. Tim joined Trulia in 2008 as a senior software engineer, rising to become a vice president of engineering and lead the development of Trulia's products for real estate agents. We also have Edward Kim. Edward is the co-founder and CTO of Gusto. Prior to Gusto, Edward was the CEO and co-founder of PickWing, a Y Combinator startup and photo printing platform. Before founding PickWing, Edward worked as a senior project engineer at Volkswagen Group of America and led R&D for cloud-based navigation and speech recognition systems. Then we have Antoine Boulanger as co-founder and CEO of OK. Antoine built Box's storage team and scaled it through 100x growth and created products worth tens of millions in annual recurring revenue. He led the NYC site of Google Spanner, which stores most of Google's structured data globally. And last, but certainly not least, we have Kalpana Jogi, is the director of engineering at Lyft. Prior to Lyft, Kalpana was the senior director of technology at Visa Inc., where she led global data product engineering teams in the United States and India. Kalpana is passionate about driving inclusion, diversity, and mentorship for engineering leaders within and outside her teams. Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for wrapping up week 3 with us. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you for such an exciting welcome, such a great introduction to all of us. You, the only person who probably puts tech debt and party kind of in the same paragraph, but we'll probably be just as excited about it as you are. Thank you all, awesome panelists. Thank you for joining us. I think we'll start at the very basics and fundamentals. What is tech debt? When we talk about tech debt, are there specific classes of symptoms that we look for? So we'd love to hear who would like to start us off.
I can kick us off. So I'm Antoine, co-founder and CEO of OK. We're building dashboards for engineering leaders to help them have a long experience with tech debt, especially in infrastructure teams. And yeah, I think usually when we talk about tech debt, it's a very vague metaphor. Everybody sort of feels bad about it, but it's kind of hard to define. And if you just decide to, let's say, solve tech debt in your company and you announce it as an engineering leader, you might actually find your team rebranding all of their projects as a tech debt solution projects. And so you have to be really careful about like the incentive you're saying. So I think for me, I'll be quick, but I think there are like 2 sides of tech debt. I think in general, it's going to be, we're getting slower and slower. So on the business side, it's going to be, for you as an engineering leader, how do you explain to your stakeholders, especially in products and in business, okay, why is the engineering team not delivering as fast as we used to deliver? And then, so that's kind of your part of your role as an engineering leader is to deal with that question. The other side of handling technical debt is the more obvious one, which is like the technical side. And usually it's similar, like engineers will feel like they cannot really produce and deliver things anymore. And then you have like many categories. I'm super curious to hear about the experience of the other panelists, like lack of documentation, can have anything from build times, flaky tests, difficulty around like changing a system, adding a new feature. Like it can cover like so many things. And so I think as a leader, you just have to make sure you define what you mean by tech debt when you're trying to help your team out of it.
Yeah, I would definitely, I would like to add Tim Correia here, GM of Trulia and part of Zillow. Yeah, I think you had a couple of things that I think are really important. Like some things that tech debt is not, because like people do love to overload it and put that in their roadmap. We need to take care of technical debt. That's why we're so slow in delivering. But it's like, I think what it's not is, one, it's not necessarily old code. Old code doesn't have to be tech debt. Actually, some code that sort of has been there for a long time or has lasted a very long time is not, it's doing its job. It's doing what it's supposed to do. It may not be the language you prefer to work in anymore. It doesn't mean it's technical debt. It's doing the work it needs. The other thing it's not, it's like people would like to categorize technical debt. It's like lack of functionality. You built a product to do feature X. Now you also want to extend to do feature Y. That's not technical debt. It wasn't part of what was the scope of what you were thinking about to begin with. So I think being very clear and classifying what is really technical debt and what is just sort of maybe lack of functionality or preference in how to do things. And I think it's also, when you think about technical debt, I really think about it in two big buckets, and I think it's important to know what you're dealing with. There's like conscious technical debt. You chose to make some trade-offs and go down this path, but it was totally a conscious decision as a team that you made, and you understand those trade-offs, versus unconscious. The person didn't really understand the requirements or didn't have the technical experience in this new technology they want to experiment with, and that puts you in a much worse place, because it's sort of unknown. It's sitting there in the dark, sort of lurking for the next person to find it.
Yeah, I think just to add on to that, one of the things that I found in most technical debt, not all technical debt, is it has to do with how different parts of your code and organization are coupled together. In other words, if you're trying to make a change to one part of your code base, a lot of times if you hear, I can't change this because I need to work with this other team and coordinate and get on their roadmap so that we can make this change together, then that could be a good sign that you have technical debt. So I think for me, what I found in my experience is that it has a lot to do with teams not being able to move, teams or individuals not being able to move independently of each other. And so I use this analogy a lot within Gusto when I'm talking about technical debt, especially when I'm talking to non-technical audiences. It's kind of like spaghetti versus ravioli. If you have spaghetti, it's like technical debt, because you try to pull on one piece of spaghetti and then you're basically, it's all tangled up with the other strands. And what you're trying to get to is more of ravioli, where things are a little bit more encapsulated, and you can make changes to each of those individual components without having to involve a bunch of other people.
Yeah, touching on something that Tim said earlier was interesting, the intentional versus unintentional. The intentional side, I think, is a lot of especially junior engineers in my career have come to me and said, oh, we need to do this right. But a lot of the time you want to get something shipped because maybe it's an experiment, or you don't know if there's going to be any adoption or if anyone's even going to use this feature. And so owning, hey, this is intentional, we are cutting corners here, is also really important so that people understand why you're doing it. But the unintentional side, there's a kind of something I call bit rot, where people keep piling on one particular file or class or set of the code base, and it just becomes a monster. I remember Tim reminded me of when I was an engineering manager, and I looked at a particular file in a Ruby on Rails code base, user.rb, the model, and there was a huge ASCII art dragon at the top of the file, and someone had put it and said, here be dragons. And so it wasn't even just people getting stressed out about that file. People would have put like a big warning flag in that file. It'd come that far. And that kind of evolved over time. It didn't start off with the dragon there. It got to the point where people would just say, I don't want to touch this file anymore. That one's a scary one.
And this has clearly been fun talking about tech debt in the form of dragons and pasta choices as well. I've had many references to tech debt. These two are not. So thank you for educating me on that. But now that we know what tech debt is, how do we approach it? Like, how do we think about strategies and methodologies for solving it? And I'll kick that off with my perspectives. I'll continue on the topic of intentional and unintentional debt. I think it's very, very important to understand that. So when I start working with a new team, or we have a team already in place, I always look to understand, is it intentional or is it unintentional, right? Are people making choices, or is it just happening? Because if it's unintentional, it's a different set of strategies. If it's unintentional, we have to start with education, right? Educating the team on what it is, why it is, the cost of incurring tech debt, right? We may even have to go with, how do you help train them with decision frameworks? When do you ship fast? When do you put a hack in place? How do you come back and take care of it? Or take it even further and talk about incentives. Like, even give incentives to folks to say, this is important, this needs to be done, as opposed to just like shipping fast. So If it's intentional, on the other hand, it's a different set of strategies, right? Like we know we're making the right choices. We just have time pressure. We are trying to ship fast. We have to put this hack in place. Then I look at it as, good, we're doing it intentionally, which is already a fantastic start. What is the plan here? Do we have a plan? Are we saying we'll come back and look at it in a month from now? Are we saying we'll look at it at the next sprint? Are we saying that after we ship, we will take an entire sprint and only do cleanup? What is the plan here? So that's kind of a bit of how I approach it, but would love to hear from the rest of you.
I think there's something that when you think about what do we do after we've made this shortcut or taken these cut the corners and intentional technical debt, sometimes shouldn't necessarily only happen on the engineering leadership side. I feel like that if you're working closely with the product team and the product team is figuring out ROI of projects, that should be factored into the ROI decisions on the product team. And so I think that when you have a product spec document, for example, that says, we're going to do this, we don't know if it's going to be successful, so we're going to try and minimize the investment on this to see what the return looks like. But if we hit particular milestones on usage of this feature or adoption of this feature or whatever metrics you're using on the product team, then we are going to invest in this code base and invest in this feature. So I feel like that it's very difficult to do that after the fact. I think you have to build those strong relationships with the counterpart in product very early on in order to have those trade-offs, because otherwise I think engineering leaders can come across as the bad guy or moaning about things a lot of the time. Whereas I feel like it should be a relationship that you forge up front.
Yeah, one thing I'd like to say as well, like I really like what Kalpana you said is talking about timeframes, because I think at the end of the day, tech debt is like one of the best ways you have as an engineering leader to sort of control or incentivize or not tech debt is the time frame you pick for projects and for rewards of people. If in a startup, for example, you might do like pretty instant rewards and you have a short time frame because you don't even know if the company is going to exist in like 6 months. Totally makes sense to take shortcuts. Once you start becoming more mature, if you stay in that mode as a leader and you don't expand the kind of the reward time frame like promotions, or you don't expand like the time frame for like, hey, is this project actually done? Then you're gonna keep actually creating tech debt inadvertently as a leader, because you're kind of telling people through the rewards you put in place that, hey, like it's okay to ship something in 3 months, a promotion, and then move on. So like really this notion of weight is like super key, in my opinion, to controlling tech debt.
Cool. I love, like, one thing James said sort of reminded me of one of the projects we worked on, where I think we went in with a decision on indexing a data set that we sort of made like an offline. It had like a 30-minute cycle to run this index on some data. And we're like, oh, yeah, we're going to throw this together because we want to get to it quick. But we're going to come back around and we're going to make this real-time streaming, and get the things into the index sooner. The reality is, as the product went to production and it grew and it was used and feedback, the latency for the type of data we were indexing, the 30 minutes never made a difference. And that system ran for 8 years and never got changed, right? So it's like, it is like, it's a constant of like, are you evaluating, measuring, challenging your assumptions at the beginning to make those trade-offs to deliver sooner, because, you only have so many opportunities for success, and sort of how fast are you sort of repeating those over and over again. But you can take inventory and understand those trade-offs. But every once in a while you'll be surprised. You never really have to be perfect, right? I think someone said, like, I want to do it right. I always tell my team, there's not a right solution. There's just solutions. There's many solutions, and there's trade-offs on all of them. Do you really understand what those are in the way you're implementing it and how it's going to impact us going forward?
That was I completely agree with that, right? And maybe that could be a good segue into my next question, which is, we've been talking about tech debt in quite a negative way, that it's like a tax, it's a burden, it's a beast that we need, or it's a dragon, as James said earlier. So is tech debt ever healthy? Is it good to have sometimes? And Tim, I know you touched upon that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Short answer is yes. I said, think about it like you do, like maybe like how you manage your money and your investments, or or as you start a business, right? Do you take all your capital and pour it all into one thing? You're like, no, actually, I'm going to raise capital. I'm going to take some debt and use that to accelerate what I do because I have to fulfill everything. And you should think about your code and things you're doing that same way. You have a scarce resource, right? Which is probably time and the number of features you could develop, like your velocity. Put those on the most important things and know it's okay. You don't have to go as deep or as perfect or right solution on some of those things. Previous company I worked at before working at Trulia, I come off in a situation where we had tons of debt, and that's sort of what slowed the company down and caused us to fail. What's another company, I think I overcorrected, had no debt, but also 2 years later, we had no company. Right? So like understanding, like you only have so many opportunities, especially early stage, like treat it as a scarce resource, make some conscious decisions on where you're gonna make trade-offs. Things aren't gonna work all the time. Don't over-architect a solution, have a hypothesis, test it, and then understand where you need to invest as things grow as a company. So yes, it is not a bad thing to take on. And as you grow as a company, a big company, I think creating that scarcity of resources, because you're going to have more resources and more time and audience, and you want to over-architect, making sure how do you continue to sort of create that environment where you are making those healthy trade-offs with that scarce resource that you have.
Yeah, I think the monetary analogy is actually a really good one. It works in so many ways. When you take out a loan from a bank, and interest rates are really low right now, so it's a good thing to do. Most of the time, if you have something that you think that you can invest in that will enable you to pay back that loan, and then you'll still come out ahead, right? And so I think this analogy works really well for technical debt, where basically I think a lot of it has to do with learning. You take on some technical debt, and that buys you some time to learn, like essentially the domain that you're working in. And once you've learned the domain, then you kind of get a better sense of how best to refactor that domain so that it lasts for the future and you come out ahead. A good example in Gusto's world is we obviously what a big part of what we do is taxes, and we started as doing payroll taxes in the state of California, which if you're in the state of California, it works like most states where you have a percentage-based tax based on the income that you're making. And that was basically, what we saw as we started to expand to other states until we got to the state of Colorado. And in the state of Colorado, we started working on a special tax in the city of Denver called the OPT tax. And this is a tax that's called it's a different type of tax. It's a head tax. So instead of a percentage of your income, it's actually a fixed dollar amount per person that you're paying every month. And we call that a head tax. And had we done the tech debt refactoring before we got to that, I think we would have refactored it in a way that we would have had to just redo it again. And so it was actually okay for a while for us to kind of do a bit of, copy pasting and build some technical debt and that gave us some time to learn how this domain of taxes really works, which allowed us to refactor it in a way that really put us ahead. And so I think it's a really good thing in that sense. And it can be very negative if you actually if you try to refactor and pay down technical debt too early.
What you shared, Eddie, definitely sounds another example of intentional debt, right? Where very intentionally you made the choice, you and your team made the choice, looked at it as an opportunity to learn. And once the learnings are in is when you went back to look to say, hey, what do I need to clear it? But sticking with the financial loan analogy, we've all taken that loan and then comes the day we need to pay it, right? I would love to hear thoughts on when that payday comes, when we actually need to pay it back. How do we justify investing a large amount of effort to tear down a big refactoring? And these things often take a long time to show outcomes. So how do we justify that with our stakeholders, with our teams? Would love some thoughts.
Yeah, I'm gonna extend the monetary analogy yet again. When you take a loan, you typically are not saving up until you can pay back the entire principal plus interest and pay it all at once. That typically doesn't happen. You pay it in installments, right? And I think this applies in the technical world as well. I think a lot of times where technical debt investments go wrong is it becomes a really big project. Sometimes it comes in the form of a 5-page doc that's explaining like what are the challenges and why we need to spend a year on this. And basically only after you pay down that technical debt, then you can start to get some value out of that investment that you made. And time again, that always fails because it's hard to get, leadership buy-in on that. And even if you're making progress, if you do get buy-in, at some point, like people start asking, why are we spending so much time on this? Because 6 months into it, you have a different priority that comes up. And the worst thing that could happen is your tech debt project gets killed halfway, and now you're in a worse state than before. And so the best way I found to get buy-in is actually take a big project and think about ways that you can break it into smaller technical debt projects, like installments really. And after each installment, making a behavioral change to your code where you can get value from that technical debt investment. So instead of having a big chunk of technical debt, we call it at Gusto structural change, and then having a big behavioral change after that where you get the benefit. We try to think about it in terms of how do we interleave this thing together, where we do some structural change and then some behavioral change, some structural change, some behavioral change. It just helps to keep the momentum going when you're making these big technical debt investments.
I feel like in ICs quite often you'll suddenly get this email that says we need to do something about this huge tech debt breakdown like Eddie was talking about there. But I think actually, and I think Tim touched on this earlier, if you work with your ICs to train on ROI and think about the business impact of these things, quite often you can vocalize and write down a business impact of smaller chunks of refactor. And I think it's worth doing that and training your ICs and your engineering leaders on how to do that as well, because there's nothing better than receiving that email saying, look, we're going to push this project back by this many weeks, best guess engineering estimate, because we think this will pay off over this time period. It's kind of, again, the financial analogy pays off really well here. We'll pay off our mortgage a lot quicker if we do this lump sum payment here. And so I actually think that it can't just be engineering leadership that is thinking about the ROI of this. As long as you train your ICs and everyone in between on the ROI storytelling, I actually think you can avoid what Eddie was talking about and getting those mega emails or huge Confluence documents getting written up about the state of the union.
Yeah, tie it to business outcomes, tie it to projects. And if you understand your business, you understand what you're doing, you'll know hey, this thing, it's not pretty, it's not great, but we haven't touched it, and nor do we have any plans to really work in that area for the next 2 years. So don't refactor for refactoring's sake. Focus on what your core products are, what your core areas are, and tie those to initiatives and help the business understand that trade-off, right? If it's time, if it's defects, because if you have technical debt, you are spending time, whether you like it or not. It's coming around to you through support, through tests, through other places. You don't want to be, so you got to sort of understand that and make a good case and sort of put your business hat on a little bit.
One thing I'll add to this is that I think usually the best way to convince both your teams, because sometimes you also have to convince your own engineers to address technical debt, or stakeholders, is having kind of typical metrics around how your system is working. Like how often are you deploying? What's your defect rate? As you said, Tim, what are for example, the ticket rate on the customer support side? I think usually in most situations I've been in where technical debt is becoming a huge business priority, all of those kind of the dashboards and metrics were flashing red, and this is usually something that your business stakeholders can understand, because let's say you say, oh, we're agile, we're going to deploy every week, and then actually 6 months later, all of the plans from product have been based on that weekly deployment schedule, but actually you're now at a 2 or 3 weeks deployment schedule because of various technical debt issues. Then you have a problem, right? And I think as a leader, you have to make sure that you can explain why this is happening and how to address it.
I completely agree with all of you, right? We have to look at what is needed. How do we break it down? How do we break it down and measure it with true business impact? A little bit, Eddie, of what you're talking about is make it bite-sized, so to speak, such that you're able to like ship it with the business impact, you're able to show value, and don't go into this black hole of, okay, we're going to do these things for the next 8 months and then come back and set this up for 8 months. Love that. We're coming up on time, so maybe the last question. We've talked a lot about tech debt. How do we feel about the impact of this tech debt on people, on our engineers, engineer morale, engineer retention? And I'll start with my perspectives. I'm a big believer that you have to embrace it. Engineers, you have to embrace it. You're not going to get through your career without dealing with it regularly. So know it, learn it, educate yourself, learn to manage it, embrace it wholeheartedly. So it should not, if you take that learning or that attitude, it should not seem like a beast or a dragon, but would love to open it up to other panelists.
I agree with that. I feel like that one thing that from the other perspective is technical debt can be a really big emotional drag on engineering teams if this is not something that is discussed and talked about and trained on. Like I mentioned earlier, train on business ROI, get your ICs and middle managers to understand why we're doing technical debt. You can't just say it's a thing, you have to deal with it. Obviously it is, I agree, but why do we have to deal with it? Because it's not something you learn in college. You have to pick it up on the fly. But I also think as managers and engineering leaders, you have to kind of take the pulse of the team. It can lead to people getting annoyed about something and then quitting because they didn't have an outlet for this. And outlet doesn't mean moaning, but it means like take the pulse of the team. Understand if everyone's saying that there's a problem with technical debt on the team, you probably should listen to that. It's one of these things that I think you have to have both sides of the coin, and listening to your team and having regular feedback sessions on this, I think is very important.
I know we're at time. This has been a fantastic conversation. I wish we had more time to keep this going. Thank you all for joining us. Back to you, Patrick.
Yes, Kalpana, I will say, if everybody wanted to go around the horn with their final remarks, we do have some time for you all to close off the session properly. So I do want to offer that up for everyone. So Kalpana, Eddie, Antoine, Tim, if you want to jump in and share your final thoughts on tech debt, we'd love to hear it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I guess I'll just kind of add on to the last question. Ultimately, it's like one of these things that's so hard to measure. And the best thing that we found was it is really about the sentiment of engineers and how easy or hard they feel it is to make changes to the code base. That's really what it's all about. If you don't have a lot of technical debt, it's going to be really easy to make changes to the code base. If you have a lot of technical debt, it's going to be really hard. And so what we do is we just send a survey out once a quarter. We call it the Engineering Sentiment Survey, and it has just a few questions. One of the questions is how easy is it to make changes to the code base? And then we basically look at the distribution of those scores every quarter. And I think there's a range in there that you want to be in. If it's like everyone's saying it's super, super easy, then you're probably investing too much in technical debt and missing out on actual business opportunities. And if it's below a certain threshold, then you're going to start to have engineers leaving because they're going to be so frustrated because they can't have business impact on the company. Yeah.
If you have a successful company, you're going to have technical debt. Learn how to make it part of your natural process, your workflow, how you think about it, how you solve it, how you talk about it. A lot of good lessons here. You're not going to stop the train. If you're successful, you're going to keep it rolling. So figure out how to make it part of your natural workflow.
I'm a little bit biased on this one as well. I would definitely say there are elements where you can measure it. I know Antoine was touching on SLAs and measurement metrics earlier. There are some areas where you can and should measure it. Error rates or customer questions and things like that are very customer impacting. Like that's what Bugsnag does. But yeah, I think in the end, it's a drag on development, and therefore getting that pulse on the team, like Eddie was saying, is probably the closest you're going to get to the real answer.
For me, it's definitely all about intentionality, right? You have to be intentional about your tech debt. Right this minute, you're either managing it or you're mismanaging it, right? So if you're not managing it, odds are you're mismanaging it. So for me, it is just be very aware of it, be very intentional about it, and everything else will fall in place.
I really agree with that last comment. I think realizing your role as an engineering leader in either creating or reducing tech debt just by the incentives you place on the team. For me, it's already half the battle. If you reward tech debt, you're going to get tech debt. If you discourage tech debt from happening, and you successfully protect your team from influences that would make them create tech debt, I think that you're going to be successful.
Wonderful. James, Kalpana, Eddie, Antoine, Tim, thank all of you so much for hosting our end of the day tech debt party and helping everybody more confidently tackle these and apply different strategies. We got Tim dancing. Yes. Wonderful. We'll see you all soon. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.